Welcome to the MSL 411, a podcast designed to equip both aspiring and experienced MSLs with the resources they need to level up their career toolkit. The heart of this podcast is to take the same industry knowledge and advice that we share with our own candidates and make it available and accessible to anyone looking for answers. So if you have questions, you've come to the right place. We're here to give you the 411. And without further ado, let's dive right in.
Today we have a guest, one of our very own senior recruiters, Rochelle, with us today. So before we kick this off, will you introduce yourself? Tell us a little bit about your career in MSL recruiting. Tell us a little bit about Rochelle and why you decided to join Symbio, why you love MSL recruiting.
Well, I'll start with the last question there. I decided to come over to Symbio because they are the best in industry, in my opinion. A little bit about me. I've been in recruiting over 15 years. In MSL recruiting or field medical for the last 13 years or so, and worked for another firm for about 9 years. I've been here almost 4 years. Absolutely love what I do. Love working with MSLs. I think they're some of the greatest people on the planet. And married, 2 boys, love to run in my spare time, have a fur baby named Hazel that's with me all the time. But other than that, just excited to be here and talk about our topic today.
Yeah. Big dog people around Symbio. We're
For
big
sure.
dog people here. We even had a day where all the dogs were in the office, and it's great.
Yeah.
Good. Well, I wanted you to come onto the podcast to talk about MSL titles. We titled this episode, What's in a Title? Because it's one of those things that everybody's confused about,
Right.
Nobody agrees about. And even I was just having a conversation with somebody today about not only is it important to convey internally within a company what a person's role is, but externally to key opinion leaders, HCPs, a company can call a job whatever they want,
Mhm.
but if their external partners don't really understand, that can be an information gap. So this is something that we talk about in the office all the time. And I thought you were a great person, given your experience, how things have changed in industry over the last decade. I think you were a great person to kind of provide some of that context. And so it's a hot topic, lots of different opinions depending on who you talk to. But I think we should start by giving a definition of an MSL. What is an MSL? What are a few examples of other titles that essentially mean MSL?
So, a medical science liaison, I think, had a more strict definition in the past. Especially when I started back in 2011, I think the scope has definitely broadened since then. MSL in the simplest terms, medical science liaison, they're responsible for being out in the field, talking to KOLs in pre-launch, launch, or launch mode, and bringing those insights back to the company and sharing that to help messaging and strategy and moving that company forward, hopefully with that product, the approval of that product, and once it's approved, hopefully a successful launch. With that said, the titles vary greatly. We never want to tell someone titles don't matter because they do. I think it depends on if you're with big company, small company. And I always encourage people to, when they're interviewing, to really find out what exactly does that mean? In other words, dig into kind of the roles and responsibilities more so than the title. Now, big pharma, they have banding. So sometimes, if you're MSL, senior MSL, some do MSL, MSL2, or associate director. Really find out what that means. Sometimes it's years of experience. Usually that's what it is, but really dig in, ask a lot of questions in the interview process. Remember, you're interviewing the company as much as they're interviewing you. And are there things you're doing in your current role that you absolutely want to continue? Are there things you don't get to do in your current role that you would like to do, or maybe experience you haven't gained yet? And really take it from there. But we do get this question just about every day.
Yep. Yeah, absolutely. We have clients who call their MSLs all sorts of things, and some are very clear to indicate it means something. Some do not really assign any difference in the meaning for that title. It's just what we call our MSLs, as they like to say. So where does that leave a candidate that is looking at 2 different opportunities with 2 different job titles? You mentioned that they really need to investigate what that means, but from the standpoint of the person's resume and their experience, is this something that should play a role in their search? A lot of people get nervous about, well, if I am in a senior MSL at this company, but this other company over here, they don't distinguish MSL versus senior versus principal, whatever the title is that going to harm me? Talk a little bit about your experience with that and what role that you think that should play in somebody's job search.
Great question. Initially, my answer is that's where we come into play, right? So if you're wanting to find out kind of what the differences are at different companies, that's when you reach out to your recruiter at Symbio and we can tell you if we know that client, what they look at when they're looking to hire someone, what that means to them. But for someone that is looking at different titles at different companies, it can be tough. We have some clients that call everyone a field medical director. We have some clients that call everyone a regional medical liaison. There's probably 50 different titles I think I've counted at some point for MSLs. So I think I come back to just making sure you understand what the roles and responsibilities are. Not always a job description tells you that. If you get the chance to talk to the company, really dive into that. Also, you may have a company that calls everyone an MSL, but you have someone that has 2 years to 20 years.
Yeah.
So, again, it is titled to some people, it's just going to be the most important thing, and that's okay.
Yeah.
Others are like, I don't care what you call me as long as I'm doing what I love and I'm being paid well. So I think that also comes down to an individual. There's no blanket answer. It's what is important to that person.
Yeah.
And most MSLs don't get too hung up on that, but there are some that are like, hey, I've worked hard to get here and that's fair. This is where I want to be. If I'm going to make a change, this is the next step, or they view it as the next step. I think that's where we come into play on really educating them on what that looks like, because it can mean many, many different things. And I think sometimes big pharma kind of trains them to think a certain way about those titles.
Yeah. And educating the hiring managers. In your experience, have you seen hiring managers being caught up on the difference in titles that they may see on somebody's resume?
I don't know if I've seen that so much.
I think that's a common fear that people have.
Yeah.
Like, well, is somebody going to look at my resume and they're going to see all these? Are they going to see this as a step backwards?
Right. I don't think they will see it as a step backwards if you are thorough if you have a good resume. At the end of the day, it comes down to having a good resume, right? So you want to make sure you have all the important pieces of the role listed on there. What drugs you've supported, if you've done pipeline support, if you have launch, have you been involved in clinical trials? I think something we're seeing a lot more of is those extra projects. So what committees have you been on? What extra projects are you doing? And are you raising your hand? Or, we have that question often, what can I do to be more marketable? And I think the person that is eager to get involved in a lot of different areas is going to be really attractive to a manager. So I don't think MSL managers view it as a step back. For example, if you're a senior MSL or an associate director, and we're recruiting for a brand new team build out and they call everyone an MSL, I really haven't had any pushback from really good MSLs. Say they're all cardiovascular and they want to be in cardio and it's something new and novel. They don't really care about the title. They're like, this is something that's new and novel. It's exciting. I'm in pre-launch, and they're more about the journey than the title. I think where that may come into play a little bit more is when you're going from one big pharma to another.
And you kind of hinted on it a little bit in the beginning, and we'll come back to the topic of banding and what role that plays. But I was reminded of a scenario I had with a hiring manager of mine, and I was talking to him about the role because they initially called their MSLs one thing, and then they switched to MSLs because we're getting too confused. It's too complicated. And so they started calling everybody MSLs. And we started working on his search. We were getting this piece of feedback from a few people of, they are taking issue with the title. What do you want us to convey on behalf of you, our client, on the topic of the title? Is that something that may change in the future? And I remember this hiring manager telling me, look, it makes absolutely no difference. We do not limit you in what you can do as an MSL within our organization based on your title, which is not always true for every company. But I am working with my HR department to work on advanced titles because I know that this is something that's important to people, even though it will do absolutely nothing in terms of opportunity and the kind of work that they can do. But I know that this is important to people. And so I think that awareness is out there. But from the hiring manager standpoint, there are a lot of hiring managers that see it as kind of meaningless because depending on the company that you're coming into, you might be coming into an environment where you're working on pre-launch support. You get to support that product through launch. And that's what the first 3 years of your career looks like.
Right.
Or another MSL could be 3 years into their career and have only worked, post-marketing and after that approval and never have had any launch experience. And so it's so, like you said, you have to have these things detailed on the resume because it's so much about the substantive work that you did versus that title.
Right.
That's only going to get you so far, especially if you're being represented by one of us who is actively talking to the hiring manager about your candidacy and what you did, not just what your title was. So my next question for you is a little bit of a spicier question.
Okay.
So, when we're talking to people who are in their job search, everybody has different reasons for why they're looking, but There are scenarios where people find themselves looking because they feel like their company is not awarding their performance or recognizing their performance. They maybe feel like they were passed over for a promotion or a title change they thought they deserved. And so they interview, they get an offer, they go to resign from their current company and they're hit with a counteroffer. What should a candidate take into consideration if they're hit with that counteroffer? They're finally given that title. What kinds of things should they keep in mind?
Well, a couple things that come to mind right off the bat is, why did it take that to get the company to give you that title? First of all, second of all, counters can be a little scary because sometimes it's just the company buying a little bit more time to find someone because they know you're looking. So, but with that said, there's some MSLs out there that have fantastic relationships with their managers, and they're great managers, and they're going to be excited for them to take that next step and do something new.
Yeah.
I would say just remind the candidate, or, to the candidates out there, remind yourself why you were looking in the first place, because there was probably something missing. Not always. Sometimes something lands in your lap and you're like, wow, this is just fantastic. I can't pass this up. I want to find out more.
Yeah.
But counters, they do happen. And again, I think at the end of the day, you really have to do some soul searching and, what am I doing now? What will this new job provide? Is it really just all about a title for me?
Yeah.
If it is, at the end of the day, then it is.
Yeah.
But really kind of figuring out what those pain points were for you to even go out and talk to another company anyway.
Yeah.
If that makes sense.
And that kind of leads into our next question about the title accompanying the compensation, because that could be the other component of it. Could be the title bump and the compensation bump that they were looking for coming out of that counter offer situation. So I wanted to kind of pivot and talk about banding and what role that plays in titles, because there are some companies that a person might be interviewing for, or within their own organization, banding plays a role in titles and compensation. So for somebody who's maybe not familiar with that term, will you kind of define that and share some examples of what that looks like in different organizations we've worked with candidates that we've worked with that are in bigger pharmas, smaller pharmas? What does that all look like?
Absolutely. And I can think of a couple examples. Of course, I'm not going to name company names, but like, for example, you may have a company where, let's say they hire an entry level or someone that has less than a year of MSL experience. That person may come in, they have a lower base. They may not be eligible for equity. Their bonus may be 15% versus 20%. So that may be like their band one. Then the next may be like, some companies have associate MSL, some have MSL, and then senior. So there's like 3 levels right there off the bat. So with that, your base salary may increase. Your target bonus could go from 15 to 18 to 20. So that could be affected, or you may not be eligible for equity until you have several years within the organization. Some organizations even have a cliff vesting for their 401k or their equity, where they'll give it to you, but it doesn't fully vest till you're there for a certain amount of time. So that's where that banding term comes in. It's usually more with bigger pharma. And then, the executive title and the principal title that people ask about, that's generally only like 5% of the team, maybe 10%. That's very rarely given out. And again, that usually bumps that person up to a higher bonus, more equity, more responsibility. They may be on a leadership track, things of that nature. But banding generally is in big pharma, and that's where you get the MSL, the senior MSL, the associate director. But at the very next company, you may have someone or have a team that's all associate directors. For example, I had a candidate that was a senior director title, MSL, but took a job with another oncology company as an associate director. So some people would look at that and say, but wait,
is that a step backward?
Yeah. And for him, it wasn't, because it was something he wanted to work in. They were able to match his comp, and it worked out. So he was one of those individuals that's like, I don't care what you call me, as long as I'm doing what I love and I'm enjoying my work.
Which I think is most MSLs. Which is why we love working with them. But I think that this is, like you said, we see this more commonly in bigger pharma environments. And I would say that most of the companies we've worked with and candidates I've worked with, people who earn that principal or executive MSL title, generally that's earned within their company. So that's not something that you can come in the door getting. They may bring you in as a senior MSL and you can grow into a principal role.
Absolutely.
But that's reserved for people within the organization is generally what I've seen. So and I think that this is an important topic to bring up, because we're seeing a lot more salary transparency laws in different states. And so a lot of times candidates will see a salary range online, and it may be a little bit different than the range that was given to us or that was given to the candidate, and they're trying to understand the discrepancy. Well, the last 10, 15K of that salary range may include the most senior person on their team who could have 20 years of MSL experience, or it may be for that principal title that's only reserved for people within the organization, but based on the way those laws are written, they have to include that information. So it can be a little bit complex for them to navigate through that, which we hope to do if the scenario arises with our client. But it kind of helps. I think this discussion kind of helps MSLs understand why that might be the case. So appreciate all your insights
Absolutely.
on all things MSLs titles. I feel like we could talk about it forever and
Yes.
never run out of things to talk about because each company is taking different approaches. And just kind of the last thing that I'll say on that is when it comes to MSL titles, the other thing that we've seen most recently that candidates are reporting a little bit of confusion about is companies that are hiring people in at the senior MSL level without any MSL experience. Can you talk a little bit about when you've seen that, why companies make that decision?
That definitely can be a sore spot. And I'll be honest, I don't know quite why companies do that. I've seen a couple companies do that. And I think keeping the internal consistency of your team is important too. And so that's something we talk a lot about to people when they're like, why, I'm a senior here, why can't I be brought in as a senior there? But they may only have a year or two of MSL experience. And we have to explain to them, well, their team on average has 4 to 6.
Yeah.
And, that wouldn't be fair per se. But there are companies that will hire people at senior without any MSL experience. I wish I could talk to an HR person at a couple of those companies to kind of figure that out. I think it probably has to do with they have very specific clinical experience in a certain space.
Yeah.
So they may be a PhD in neurology and they've done research in that very specific disease state and that company is about to launch in that space. Or they have a PhD in cancer biology and they've done the most recent, clinical trial work in that space. So usually there is some reasoning behind it.
Yeah.
If you look specifically at that candidate that was brought in as a senior, but I think the pandemic also changed a lot of things. And 21, 22, we saw salaries get inflated a little bit. And so another reason they were bringing people in at that title is because to get them at the pay band to compete with the market. But because it was a bigger company, they couldn't pay them that unless they had the senior title.
Right.
So there's some things going on in the background there too.
Which creates turmoil in the team because
Correct.
they're looking at the internal equity and saying, well, wait a minute.
Right.
I walked in the door with an MSL title. What's going on right now? So all that said, there's a lot to take into consideration. And
the market's always changing.
The market is always changing.
That's, if there's one thing consistent in our industry, it's always changing. And so I think we'll continue to see new things happen out there with titles.
Absolutely. Well, we'll have you back for your perspective on those new things. Thank you so much for your time, for doing this for us.
Thank you.
We hope you guys learned a lot, enjoyed this episode. Please send us a message on LinkedIn if you've got comments or questions for us. Thanks so much.
Thanks for tuning in. If you enjoyed today's episode, don't forget to share the link, let your friends know, and of course, connect with us on LinkedIn. And if you want more information on today's topic, please feel free to reach out. Be sure to check back soon as we continue to explore the topics that matter most to you in medical affairs.